Namaste, beautiful ladies, this beautiful morning. So we can just start by short introductions. So just for the benefit, I am Iveta, young Amanda, and I would love to have a longer introduction of our guests. So Michelle, a little bit about you to start with.
I'm Michelle Figueroa, and I'm a licensed therapist in the United States. I kind of specialize in trauma, PTSD work. I perform modalities such as EMDR and IFS, internal family systems, to help people with trauma integrate and move past the automatic triggers that come up that are conditioned through trauma.
And how long have you been in this work?
6 years. Prior to that, I was in art education, and then was thinking about being a counselor in the schools, but decided you couldn't actually do deep work in those positions, so I wanted the clinical license and practice. I have my own practice now. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, I do some virtual sessions as well as in person.
That's cool. That's super cool. Yeah. Elizabeth.
I'm an LPC, and I do a lot of work with people and patients doing ketamine treatments for recovery from depression, and do a lot of integration work with people doing psychedelics, and mostly my clients suffer from kind of chronic deep depression, suicidality, and child-based trauma.
Wow, that's really deep work, and it's so beautiful to hear that you can integrate psychedelics into recovery, and it's so foreign for so many people, and maybe you could share a little bit, what has the experience been working with psychedelics, because you've mentioned one of the evenings here that it's like a speedier recovery. Like, what are the advantages, I guess, working in psychotherapy?
I think one of the advantages is that psychedelics, depending on what psychedelic, they're not all equal for sure. They can open you up into a deeper unconscious that talk therapy can't get to all the time. Because we hold a lot of things in our body, and we hold a lot of things that we may not be conscious of, and that we develop patterns in the world that we just kind of go on autopilot. And sometimes those psychedelics can help us get out of that autopilot and open up different perspectives for us. And once those are opened up, then we can use talk therapy again, or EMDR, or something to kind of ground us in what we learned in the psychedelic experience, and kind of take that experience into our everyday life and start changing our patterns and our automatic responses. That's what I've learned. Yeah.
That's brilliant, actually. Yeah.
When she's talking about protective patterns, I know I've mentioned before parts work with internal family systems, how we develop trauma will cause us to respond to our environments in different ways than we normally would as a child, because we learn, okay, it's not safe to do this or to show up in this way, and so we become protective. So say someone has learned it's not safe to share much about them because it could be used against them, right? So they kind of harden themselves to vulnerability. That's kind of what she was referring to, I believe, right? When you're talking about it. Yeah, so those parts that maybe in therapy, because they have been so deeply conditioned and ingrained, because people are conscious as you're doing like EMDR, or they're more in control, right? It's sometimes hard for them or even for the therapist to recognize that's what's happening and to let that guard down. And so the psychedelics can kind of not force it, but really help that soften. I just wanted to add that's sort of those protective parts.
Because you are experimenting with it now as well with psychedelics and therapy. Could you share a bit about your experience with that?
Sure. I think that's the main thing that I have noticed with whether it's MDMA microdosing or psychedelics used in therapy sessions. There's, no matter how vulnerable you can be in talk therapy, there's still those parts that are on autopilot, like she said. So even if you're aware of them, it's hard to understand. If they've been with you for decades of your life, it's hard for you to let them down. I don't know how to explain it. It's very, they're pretty ingrained. And you can try, to get them to step aside, but there might not even be an awareness of how to do that if they've been there so long. And so I think that is, again, part of what I've noticed with the microdosing that helps that happen with, and you don't have to try, and there doesn't have to be a lot of awareness around it. It just kind of helps things just kind of unfold and step aside a little bit.
And bring the unconscious to the conscious.
Yeah.
So that what's unconscious can actually be seen and then worked with, and whatever comes up in those psychedelic experiences, the visions, the different symbols, the different experiences. In my experience, I was a snake being eaten by a snake.
Oh, wow.
And I had no idea how to process that because I didn't know, but it's actually the symbol of the snake being eaten by a snake, which is an ancient symbol.
Oh, yes.
But I would not have known that.
How did you integrate that symbol or that experience?
I called up a friend of mine who's a shaman, and I said, here's what happened. And in the I'm explaining it as if I understood it in the moment, but in the moment I didn't know what was happening. Like, I knew it was a snake. I thought I was being eaten by a snake, but I didn't really know what was happening. And it's when you start to be able to understand those ancient symbols, then you integrate it. Oh, it's a period of renewal. It's a period of regeneration. It's a period of shedding the skin. And then you kind of understand what those symbols are.
The deep archetypal understandings that we kind of, some would say we all have.
Exactly.
That come out, And I guess one way I would phrase is the protective parts, I'm speaking in IFS terms again, internal family systems, they often are protecting exile parts, or in shamanic traditions this would probably be similar to lost parts of the soul, right? The parts that get lost, that get fractured and split off during trauma. They're protecting those parts, and so why it's important that it steps aside with MDMA or psychedelic use or whatever, or in any kind of therapy, that's what you're trying to do, is to get them to step aside so that you can get to the wounded part and reintegrate it, right? And it's often very painful because the part that was exiled is a part of you, and there's a lot of grief in coming, even though you now at this point can understand why that needed to happen and why that was useful in one part of your life. There's still a lot of grief in realizing, like, oh my gosh, I've made decisions out of this protective state and not a true genuine sense of self for how many years. There's a lot of grief in that reunion, and the medicine makes that easier too.
Sure.
But then afterwards, I think people need to understand that that's why integration is so important, because there's a lot, you're going to start feeling things again, and your worldview shifts, because if for so long you were living out of this sense of, I'm not good enough, and therefore I'm going to do this to protect myself and be safe, and now you've realized all along you were good enough, and you made mistakes or you chose certain relationships, or you chose a path, like a career path based on that, and there's going to be a lot of emotions that come up after that. That's why I think you need to really properly prepare people before and after any kind of medicine use, because if people have done no work on themselves and then they get thrown into this and all of a sudden they're going to the deepest parts, it's like,
that's actually very true.
That can result in like a bad trip. Have you seen that?
I have. I've seen some bad trips, and especially if you don't have a person who's managing that and who's helping integrate. So it can seem really scary, but can actually be really powerful. During the integration process, you realize, wow, that was really a terrible experience, but in actuality it was healing.
And if you have had experiences with people having bad experiences, what support do they get?
Bad experiences,
bad.
Right?
Just emotionally difficult,
I've been there, and I've been through it, and I'm stronger than ever, so I know that bad, but it's still interesting, like how. Because that's the thing, like, I can share my own experience that I did have a really bad experience, but it was just really, really difficult. And because of the stigma that exists around this topic, I'm on my own with this. So I have to integrate this on my own. I have to go through with this on my own. And it's interesting, how do people get support then if it isn't just them on their own, if it's actually a thing that's available,
I would make friends with it. I always say, whatever that experience is, it's coming up to tell you something and to make friends with it. Even if it feels like it's really hard, it's there for your benefit ultimately. And maybe the container was a little weak. Maybe there was something in there that needs to be healed and brought up. And it feels bad because we don't feel like we can contain it, and then we put a judgment on that, which creates even more suffering, and then we kind of go down the rabbit hole with that suffering. And the way to kind of bring yourself back up is make friends with it, and this is good for me, even if it feels really bad.
Yeah, you're saying like the idea that if things feel bad, then it is bad, versus a more holistic view of life, that good and bad is normal to experience in life. And instead of punishing yourself like, oh, there must be something wrong with me because I feel bad about something. Absolutely.
And who to say that a good experience is better than a bad experience?
It's all perspective.
I think
perspective.
I think that's not the lie, but the misconception with healing, where people think it's going to be like a spa day. You know, like I'm going to get this feeling, and it's just I'm going to feel better as it goes on. But in reality, there's this meme on Facebook. They use tarot cards to describe it. It's like what I feel like a spiritual awakening is going to be like, and it's the sun card. And then what it actually is, it's a tower with things burning and people falling, and that's essentially spiritual awakening. And I believe it's essentially trauma healing. You're peeling away everything that is not you, your original core self, and that's what we've accumulated from life, right? How it's changed us, and that is trauma. I view trauma as anything that shifts how you view yourself, others, in the world in a way that's not, you know.
And that's what I'm really interested in, this relationship with you coming from a therapy background between what we call a spiritual awakening, because we're from the spiritual awakening background and you're from the trauma background. Like how
do they merge together? How do they work together?
What you feel like, what's the relationship there? Because I see this relationship and feel it so strongly.
But how do you explain it to someone that maybe doesn't have any knowledge with it, you know?
Well, if you look at a spiritual awakening, okay, so religion, I think it teaches you spirituality is different than what I've come to understand spirituality is. I think spirituality is getting back in touch with you, your core self, as a divine being, right? The divine is in us. And so trauma work, by removing anything that inhibits that or gets in the way of that, is getting you back to that essence, right? That pure essence. So I didn't realize going into therapy, I don't know about you, especially with trauma work, they make it so clinical. They make it seem so, I guess clinical is the only thing coming to mind. Operational. Yeah, like.
In what way?
There's no spirituality. You're not supposed to talk. Well, you can talk about spirituality, but only in the terms of the client's beliefs. But as I started to do EMDR, which is dealing with subconscious processes that come up with the eye movement, which is simulating the same process that we have during our REM sleep, which is when we believe we integrate and you know, all of our dreams that mean something. I started to notice that people, like, their own religious beliefs were there in that, and I started to, there was just this realization through doing therapy and watching how people's bodies even respond. Like, people's bodies will shake, and like things that we've seen in breath work or anything like that. That process gets stimulated, and I was just like, there's something's happening here that is beyond clinical. And looking further into it, so Francine Shapiro was the psychologist who developed EMDR, or I don't know if you want to say discovered it, or I don't know, brought it to being.
I'd actually like to know more about how does the process of EMDR work, because I've heard of it, but I don't know what it actually is as well. Sure,
yeah, I can tell you about that. But real quick, she was, someone asked her if she had a spiritual experience in the woods. This is where she discovered that when her eyes moved back and forth as she was walking on the path, the things she was thinking about started to feel less intense. So she discovered just naturally that eye movement has some effect on your emotional response to things. Wow. And so anyways, they asked her if she had a spiritual experience, and she said, yes, we just can't say that. Like, I think out there, and Carl Jung, you know, the depth psychology, he uses archetypes. So, or Jung, I think there is within the profession, there is an understanding that you are doing soul care, but you just can't really say that because insurance companies don't like that, and
that's insane. That actually stirs up really difficult emotions in me, because I'll just jump in with a short story. We actually met a guy, which I literally can't stop thinking about the story. This guy had a diagnosed schizophrenia, and he was like, actually, I think I'm just super sensitive to the other side. Like, I know there's the other side, and I'm gonna just go off all these antidepressants that he was prescribed, and everything. He was on them for ages, and then he decided to go off them by himself because his, I guess, psychologists weren't, I don't know, in agreement with it. And he literally traveled to South America to participate in like ayahuasca ceremonies, San Pedro ceremonies, and go through that process of growth.
Research in Europe, which I was very impressed, because that's the thing, in Europe there's, I think, even more stigma than in the States. Like, to do with research and psychedelics.
So he was actually working with like another more open psychologist in Germany, I believe, who was tracking his progress, his story of recovery by himself, because he went off the antidepressants by himself, which it's probably not recommendable, but he did it like in a super careful way. And then he was going into this whole like shamanic path and understanding that like actually a lot of the voices in your head can be maybe removed or cleared by closing the space in a shamanic way and performing clearings. And he said there was even like an article some time ago where a shaman turned up to this psychiatric hospital, and he walked in and he like looked around and he was like, oh, what a waste, because all these people would actually be like spiritual leaders in all culture, because they're just on the other side, and like they have the capacity and the ability to communicate. Not to say, of course, there are like dangerous cases. I do know of like malicious deities maybe, or beings speaking into your ear, but yeah, I believe that a lot of that could be solved by in a shamanic clearing way, rather than feeding someone like tablets, which I just had really difficult feelings stirred up about it for ages, because I just thought about the amount of people that are just locked up in these hospitals and they don't know what's happening, and like in a different culture with like a different understanding, less stigma around the whole thing.
To, like,
they
learn how
to work with it.
Using protection, or I mean, there are even homeopathic and naturopathic remedies that can help with some of that too. I mean, I know a few practitioners that have had good results working with clients.
And I
just helping with that.
Totally. I would say that's absolutely true. And if you are someone who's suffering from that type of thing, get help. Don't do it by yourself. I do believe that sometimes you can do it by yourself, but I think in our society we're so groomed to not be able to do it that it might cause more harm if you try to do it by yourself and you don't have a foundation.
What kind of help would you suggest? Would you suggest looking into spirituality first and like working with like a shamanic kind of environment, or go?
I mean, I think that there's, if you're on medication, some people can go off it by themselves, but some people can't. Sometimes it has an actual brain chemistry effect, and if you try to go off of it without titrating in the right way, you can do a lot of harm to your brain.
Yeah, for sure.
So, like, it sounds like this guy was working with a psychologist and did it in a way that was working. But I just had to put it out there that really be careful, go off of it. And I totally believe that a lot of these diseases that we have diagnosed are not really diseases.
So like the MMPI will have questions that sometimes I get so many people that go in for, like, say ADHD testing, and what they do is they have to run a battery of tests. So they do the MMPI and then the WACE, the IQ test. And what that does is it kind of gives them a broad spectrum of like, okay, what else could it be? What other diagnosis could be there? And so it will have questions on it, like, do you have visions, or do you hear voices, or do you, like, things that basically they're trying to,
right?
They're trying to understand if you have delusions or hallucinations. But for some of those things, for someone who's spiritual, in breath work or certain ceremonies that don't use substances even, they do. Or even I would say, I have visions, or, voices, not necessarily like you hear someone like they're standing right here, maybe you do, but what they would say where that becomes an issue, well, first of all, that's going to flag probably delusions and schizophrenic. It's and so people get really scared, especially if they're spiritual. They're like, wait, I might have ADHD and PTSD, but it's also saying potentially schizoaffective personality disorder. And so that can be really damaging because people get really scared. They're like, wait, what does this mean? But I would say that line is where it becomes an issue to functionality, right? Because if someone is hearing voices and it's just part of their spiritual understanding of the world and it doesn't affect their ability to go to work or have relationships or whatever, so that's kind of where you draw that line. And I just want people to know, if you feel like you're connected to something else, it does not mean you're schizophrenic, or if you're here, you know. It's really how you interpret it, and there's a lot of things culturally there, and our system unfortunately is not sensitive to that too. I've had clients who are from Asian or African descent that have very different spiritual beliefs that get flagged potentially as having that, and you have to explain it through a cultural lens, like, no, you don't, you're functioning, this is not.
Yeah, that's super, super sad. I just hope that this information can eventually reach everyone, because I couldn't imagine anything worse than just feeling like you have something wrong with you.
I've been there a little bit too, like, not there, but at a point where I'm like, I don't know, like, is this real life anymore? Like, what's happening?
But would you believe, like, because you don't have that spiritual development and understanding and knowledge from when you're when you're a child, then you think, oh, okay, that's something wrong with you. But once you actually start meeting people like yourselves and just going onto this path and understanding that, like, yeah, actually, most of the people we now know and hang out with, like, they're going on a spiritual path, they are more sensitive to energies, they feel things around themselves that a normal human being who scrolls on Facebook 24/7 probably doesn't feel anymore. Then you just realize, like, actually, yeah, that's normal, this is okay.
But why is it? Why do you think it is so shut off, like, spirituality? Because I feel like we should move forward towards, like, a holistic approach, and I really hope that that's what it's gonna get to eventually. But why is it so strictly shut off, like, spirituality?
Because spirituality gets you in touch with yourself, and it tells you that you can communicate directly with source,
and
right?
You don't need to go through the church, for example, who's in control of things, my opinion.
Right, so you don't need a middleman, and if you can think for yourself and by being in touch with yourself, you care and love others, it's going to be harder to motivate you to do the things that, you know, maybe people want you to do, that are more based in greed and control and fear and stuff, right? So a self-actualized person is not fearful usually, or, you know, it's much harder to incite fear, and they're less controllable would be my, I mean, if you look throughout history, I would encourage anyone listening to just kind of do the research yourself and see why things have developed and why things have been put into place, and, you know, there are patterns.
And when, like, the main religions that are in control now of the world today, when they came about, they absolutely demonized any ethnic religions that were super about connecting to yourself, to the earth, to nature. Like, people were very happy in their own little ethnic religions, which were all connecting them in one way or another in the same way. But they were like, no, demonized. Like, for example, in Lithuania, when writing, so paganism, for example, was a religion which was very much like spread by word. And then when they introduced the whole thing of writing, they literally just demonized it to such an extent and let, like, Christianity in to just say that, like, anyone who's pagan at this point is just going straight to hell, you know, like, and then people live out of fear. And then it's been rooted in us for so long now that, like, you can't really explain to other people, you know, that this is not how it is.
What also is happening these days that I feel people have fear of experimenting, for example, with psychedelics.
Also, why is that?
And I have a question as well, in terms of you working with ketamine and you doing some work with psychedelics. Is it you just being there with that and people reaching out to you, or is it you sometimes recommending it to people, or how does it work? How open are people in your experience to that kind of stuff? Because in my experience, there are people who are open and they're the ones that are open, but there would be people who would have so much fear of that kind of experience and think that this is like drugs and just...
Yeah, this is not something that can be recommended yet to clients.
Except if you're talking about ketamine, because ketamine's legal, but the others are not legal.
Okay, so you could recommend ketamine? I
could recommend ketamine, but I'm very careful with who I recommend ketamine to, because it's a power dynamic, and I don't want to use I want them to be comfortable. It's an extreme experience. These psychedelics are extreme experiences, and I want them to be comfortable with the power dynamic, because I hold a lot of power as a therapist in the relationship, and I could recommend it and they could just go do it because I recommended it, versus kind of checking in with them. And people with trauma, they would go do it because I recommended it, but then they don't find their own agency to say, okay, who am I in this world and do I want to go do this?
So who do you then end up recommending to? What's the process? How do you decide who?
I bring it up and I ask them to go do research. And then they go do research, and the people that are drawn to it will come back and say, yeah, I think this is for me. The people who are not drawn to it will come back and say, they won't even bring it up in session, right? They won't even kind of broach that topic again. And so then I let it go. And then maybe 3 months later, they come back and they say, what was that thing you were talking about? And then it's more of it's from them and not from me.
How was it with you when you came across it?
It was recommended to me by my therapist.
And you went and did research?
I did. And it was something that changed my life completely, doing ketamine, because I had a chronic underlying depression. And that brought me out of it. Ketamine it brings you out of the depression pretty quickly, but it's not necessarily sustainable unless you then actually go do work. But it gives you enough freedom to then figure out what's going on, to actually process some of the deeper stuff that's going on, and gives you some insight.
So it gets the wheels turning. Like kind of, starts that, exactly.
I feel like that's my experience with all psychedelic experiences, though, that they would never really heal me forever unless I continue doing the work. Some of the things that I realized are just like a Kickstarter to go forward.
But they do speed it up, because they open your consciousness to a level that you genuinely did not understand that there, you can reach. It like brings you up to, like Shrihar said, like brings you up to a certain level in the mountain.
To the top of the mountain.
To the top of the mountain.
Drops you back.
And then drops you back. And then you can, but at least then you know the way, and you can, keep on going up.
It can take years off of psychotherapy, for sure.
Years.
For sure.
Wow.
Well, some people. I don't want to say that for everybody. I don't want to give an expectation for everyone. It just depends on where you are.
In my area, there are therapists this is who I've been doing this with, like providing and receiving from. And so when a client is not an actual therapy client, but a co-therapist who agreed to do this as part of our group is who I'm going to be referring to here. She had been working in her own therapy for years about sexual molestation when she was a child from her brother, and she just couldn't, it was so distressing that she was working on many different things but kind of couldn't go there into that topic. But through the MDMA microdosing that we did, she was able to finally go there, and because that just kind of took that edge off to the point where she could then sit with it and then move through it. It can really help people get there much sooner. And that would be one example.
That makes sense.
And I feel like compelled to say, I believe totally in psychedelics. I believe totally in healing. And it is a journey. It is not a one pill, one thing fixes everything.
No way.
I have so many people that come in to get ketamine, in a clinic that want a quick fix. And it's never ever going to be a quick fix. It is a journey.
I think what you're saying is that's an accelerator. It can be an accelerator, and but with acceleration sometimes it can be more intense than after, right? Because now you're like, oh, but
totally.
Everyone's journey is different.
And how does it actually work? For example, using MDMA, so you actually go through processes with them while they are on MDMA, like a microdose of them? Because with ketamine, they just have their own experience, and then after you integrate it, I wonder how do you actually combine, again, like the therapy with experiences? So
with MDMA, you can kind of go in with an intention if you want, kind of honestly like we've done with breathwork or dance here. You can go in with an intention and also be open to whatever comes up, because that's going to happen. And usually there's a playlist, some music to kind of get things relaxed and then kind of eventually stimulated. And sometimes, I mean, usually things will come up naturally that they'll want to start talking about, or they'll start sharing what they're seeing and feeling, and you can kind of go off of that if they want to. I imagine, because again, I have not done this with clients. If I was to, in the future when it's legal, use this with a client, I would have a lot of knowledge of their parts already, because we would have been doing prep work for this. Parts meaning internal family systems and their background, and I might be able to bring that in and understand what they're talking about and help them move through that more quickly, or help them move through that in the moment, and honestly kind of do what feels like a typical therapy session while they're on the microdose. And then some people don't want to talk at all. Some people just kind of want to be there and talk about it after. So it kind of depends on the person, what that would look like. But usually, there's music involved, several hours, and you're there for support if they need it. And you can help them go deep if they want it and need it. And
and I think for ketamine, there's many different ways to do it, because sometimes you do an IV, and it's an anesthetic. So if you do an IV, usually people can't talk while they're on ketamine. But you could do a lozenge and do ketamine-assisted therapy, where you have a lower dose so you're able to interact and you're able to process, kind of like a microdose of ketamine. You could do intramuscular, which doesn't last as long as an IV. Mostly, I think it depends on who you talk to. It's such a new thing. We're all just learning about what it is and how to integrate. I have my opinions about what my experience is with my clients and what works, and other people have their opinions. And the research is new to what is happening, and kind of in the research, they're using more of a lozenge type of experience and doing ketamine-assisted therapy. But there's many different ways to go about that. I do integration within 24 hours or 48 hours after their experience. Sometimes I do it right after their experience if they can tolerate it and talk. And sometimes it's 24 hours to 48 hours after. More than 48 hours, the experience kind of degrades a bit in their heads, and they've already made up stories about what that experience was. So as you get it pretty close to their experience, then they're more open and they can access things inside a little bit better than they can when the experience kind of has worn off. And
what do you think about people just doing like their own healing, even if they have like a depression or going through some like difficult times in their life, but they choose to go like on their own path and participate in like ayahuasca ceremonies and all that? Do you have any insight on that in terms of like? Yeah,
I do. I feel like that's great. There's some people who can do that for sure, and they may not, I don't want to stock rank people's experiences, but they may not have the level of depth of experiences that are harmful to their psyche that others have. And in that case, they can actually go through that. I would always recommend, for something like ayahuasca, having somebody there for integration, because ayahuasca speaks in different symbols, and it's not clear what that symbol is. It's not clear what that message is. And unless you have a deep-rooted foundation in the way ayahuasca talks, because it is a medicine, mother ayahuasca, then sometimes you can misinterpret what's happening. And so I do think it's good to have somebody experienced with how medicine talks.
I actually now feel like I need a bit of integration, because my first ayahuasca experience was super clear, and I actually got so much healing out of it. I was able to access so many hidden parts of myself and open up all these gifts. I feel like that was the starter of it, where my gifts started coming out, and it was just so mind-blowingly amazing. But my second one, it was also beautiful, but I was getting a lot of symbols that I'm now realizing I actually don't know what they mean or how to integrate them.
Actually, that second one, I was getting a lot of symbols, but for me it was like a lot to do with death, just.
And let's say, like death, I mean, you're pretty experienced, but let's say death comes up in your ayahuasca and you don't know what that means, and you think it's actual death in our culture the way we think of it. That's going to be pretty disturbing if you don't quite understand what that means. And I'm very new to ayahuasca. Very new to it. You know, I would. It's a learning process.
Yeah, for sure.
Another thing actually around death is, like anyone who is on the spiritual path can understand death as like a step in the cycle of life. And I was also reading up on the ethnic religions, for example, or like paganism, which is also a beautiful not a beautiful experience, but like a beautiful step in your lifetime. And now it's just such a fear-inducing thing in the society, and like how did it get to this is also sad.
You're saying paganism is a fear-inducing concept in society, or
No, now, like, I mean, like, I feel like the ruling religions in the world now have made death be such a fear-inducing thing, whereas before people were more connected, for example, to nature and understood that death is a natural part of your natural life, and they had like more, they were okay with it, I guess, or more okay with it than now, and now it's just such a huge thing.
Totally. Maybe not okay with it, but they knew how, they still had the grief and the mourning, but they were taught how to mourn.
And allowed to mourn. We are sort of taught to, we are taught, especially in the Western cultures, to repress and to hold that emotion in and to kind of carry on, move on, and that is what creates trauma, is not allowing our nervous system to have its natural response to whatever, whether it's fear or sadness, grief, whatever. That is what creates trauma. And then also, there's one other point about that. Other cultures, you know, when I went to Chichen Itza, they were talking about how people were kind of not looking forward to, but when they would be in their 50s, kind of like, okay, preparing, because they believed in reincarnation and this idea that the soul is immortal, but not that, I don't know, my theory is potentially that certain religions bringing in the idea of severe punishment after death creates a lot of anxiety about death.
Exactly.
So I think it's definitely how to mourn, as well as what you believe about your soul and where it goes and what happens. And
because like, say for example, some of the smaller ethnic religions, like they used to bury people with like lots of jewelry and stuff for their next lifetime, and it was kind of made in a joyous way to like let the person go into their next stage with all the good, you know, that you can put in. And definitely now there's just so much anxiety of like, what's going to happen, and I have to live according to all these rules so that nothing happens.
I'm reading this book called Womb Awakening, and it was talking really beautifully about, again, some ethnic religions that were really to do with like this connection with nature, but the cycle of life and death. And there used to be like keepers of birth and death, and they used to be these women that used to gather and sing and dance and like do breath work and whatever while a woman was, for example, giving birth. And then at the same time, if somebody's dying, they again gather and they like lead them into the other world. They sing, they dance, and like I felt this so much. Like,
we said we were gonna do it. Like, I definitely want someone to sing when I'm giving birth, for sure, please. That's
and
so
dance
beautiful.
And like raise the energy and like do all this. it was powerful to read. I almost like remembered something. I was like,
then in some like African tribes, this was such a beautiful story. Like the woman who is pregnant chooses a song to sing the whole time while she's pregnant, and then when the baby is born, women come and sing the same song during the process of birth. Then when like up until the child grows up, the mother keeps singing the song to him the whole time, like on special occasions like birthdays and like good times, so that the child identifies the song with like beautiful moments. And then when he's going through like a low time in his life, then he uses the song as a mantra to bring himself
remember
back
who he is
and remember. Yeah, that's beautifully said, actually. And that's so nice.
I think I read that too, how don't they actually go out when they're even thinking of conceiving a child, and then the song comes to them?
Yes,
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 that's really cool.
That's really cool, actually.
Yeah,
that's beautiful.
Yeah, and that's what made me think as well that trauma starts at birth. Even I think like the way we are born these days in hospitals, like it's not this like nice welcoming where women are sitting around and singing. It's like this traumatic separation, cut off the umbilical cord. It's crazy. So there's a lot of trauma to be processed for all of us.
For sure.
Yes. I had a thought, just we had talked about, you were asking about the connection. I think we got sidetracked with all the other good things, but with spirituality and the connection to therapy. One thing I realized while doing EMDR, just to explain it briefly, EMDR is using eye movements back and forth. So you are consciously moving your eyes while you are processing a memory, a target memory that you identify as kind of the root of an issue. But anyways, that eye movement back and forth stimulates the brain, a bilateral stimulation back and forth in the pattern, and that is what our brain is doing during REM sleep, which is when we have what we believe, full access to our subconscious, and our amygdala is activated, fear, aggression, all of those things are present. That's when we have to be actually in sleep paralysis. Everyone goes into sleep paralysis so that we don't move during that time and harm ourselves. But anyways, let's get into the nitty gritty. So we simulate that process while you're conscious in session to give you better access to the subconscious and help work through thought processes and beliefs that are usually blocked, right? And so I realized with that, that's very similar. The state, the brainwave state that gets you into during that process is very similar to what like shamanic drumming will do on a journey, or there's certain methods of dance, like using dance and certain movements, like the back and forth. That's that's a bilateral stimulation that can kind of get you into a trance state. So other spiritual practices, I realized, even though this is very clinical and very comfortable for a lot of people who don't want to like move around, or they just don't really maybe understand some of those spiritual practices, it's doing a very similar thing. And in the therapy session, and then with the internal family systems, parts work, as I mentioned before, that I started to realize this is basically a shamanic, like a soul journey. You're retrieving lost parts of self and integrating them and becoming friends with them, and kind of choosing to live with them, no longer like separate and fractured from self. And even though it's gone about a different way, I just started to realize, like, just knowing spiritual traditions and other, not even in other cultures, just knowing certain spiritual practices, I started to make those connections, and I was like, oh, we're clinically helping people spiritually. So
that's powerful though. I'm so happy right now. I actually feel happy that although the system is like, no, this is no spirituality, don't mention it, in that system there are people like you that are holistic and know the crack.
It feels a little deceptive. I mean, not deceptive, but it feels okay. I will say I feel like there's a little appropriation there. Someone who created these systems and maybe whitewashed, you could say, like made it very approachable for certain populations who would be scared of an ethnic culture, that doing that tradition. This is very profitable for them, by copywriting these systems of modalities. But It is working. It is getting people in touch with themselves. So maybe that's the most important thing. I don't
know. But good point. Good point.
I feel like even talk therapy, right?
Yeah.
Is spiritual because, and they don't know it, but we're holding space. The therapist is holding that therapeutic space for people to feel themselves. And in order to do that, the therapist has to understand what that is and understand who they are and understand what we would call transference or counter-transference. The client transfers on us, we counter-transference on them. We need to understand all of that, which is energetics.
Yeah, it is.
Right? And so we need to understand what our energetics are, but we don't talk about it in terms of energetics when we're learning in the schooling. But it actually is, because we're actually learning how to hold space, reflect back, and reflect themselves back to them.
Yeah, wow.
And a therapist that knows how to do that really well is actually spiritual. And I think anybody who would say to me that they're not, I would argue with them that they are, if they're really good at what they do.
For sure.
Maybe not everybody has that term spiritual attached, but it's there.
I think there are definitely some that are more transactional, or you think you used operational, where it's very like, I mean, not that these modalities are exclusively this, but like maybe DBT, CBT, very cut and dry.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, and but I agree with you.
Totally. And my clients, sometimes we get to a spiritual point or a point in their lives where that cut and dry, actually they need it.
Yeah.
They need to know, because they never learned it in childhood, the kind of what happens and the behaviors and how their emotions relate to their behaviors and what happens in the brain, which is helpful, I think, sometimes for people to understand that. And then they can go back and do the more deeper spiritual work.
Well, I would even say that the cut and dry, then if you're understanding yourself better, then maybe that is spiritual too.
Good point. Yes.
Remembering who we are.
And understanding who we are and how we operate.
Yeah.
I also feel the need to say that some of the scientific stuff and some of the things that we have accomplished in the Western world is really important.
Sure.
And we should partner with it and use the ancient modalities. Don't throw the scientific accomplishments that we have had out with the bathwater, but integrate those so that they're not harmful as they have been.
Yeah.
I fully believe, like, if we partner, if we look at it with a holistic perspective and not like a us versus them, like there's all of it is useful. I think that's the way of the future. I think that's
Actually, on my psychedelic experiences, I always end up, this is how I end up. There's 2 rooms in front of me, and I can perfectly go into the right now modern world scientific like this, and I'm always also very much there, and I like see how they perfectly combine and interact. And usually during these experiences, I'm so good at like explaining and breaking down how everything just works together to unite, and I feel so passionate about it that I just have high hopes, and that's it.
Well, I think that science is now explaining what a lot of these ancient traditions knew. They understood it worked. They knew the correlation, but we didn't have the proof, so to speak, other than just experience. And so now, I mean, I think there's some problems there. I think that because for a while the Western cultures did pretty horrible things to indigenous cultures and said that those practices were savage, and put them in boarding schools and said you couldn't practice that. And so there's been a lot of like that ripped away, and now we are discovering that those things were real and they work, and we have the technology to show how and why. Like, for example, germ theory used to be a theory in the 1800s, people saying, oh, well, my hand's not dirty, so I'm not passing anything. But they're like, no, there's these things that are invisible that are, and people are like, well, you're crazy. But now we have technology to see it, right? And that's what's happening with these practices, understanding what's actually happening in the body. Like when you do the ohms, that actually vibrates and stimulates the vagus nerve, and that the parasympathetic nervous system is activated. But so all of that, it does go together, but I guess I just want to point out the problems that some people see with that. There might be resistance because of, the stifling of that, and now it's okay because Western science is proving it to be okay. So just an awareness, not that we shouldn't integrate, but just there's some hard feelings out there about that.
For sure.
Well, thank you very much for a beautiful conversation. And
I'm inspired. There are good people in the world.
Yes,
It's gonna change.
Okay, let's close our sacred space with an om. Thank you so much. Let's inhale to exhale. Inhale to chant. Namaste.